Hello and welcome to the Senedd Sources Podcast, where we take you inside Welsh politics. I'm Ollie Cole, and also on the podcast, Joe Kiernan, former advisor to First Ministers Rhodri Morgan and Carwyn Jones. Before that, a journalist for ITV Wales, and now a senior consultant with Cavendish Consulting. Hello, Joe.
Hiya, Ollie. How are you doing this morning?
All good. Thank you very much. A little bit full of a cold after the Labour conference. However,
Conference cold, it's a plague,
yes,
isn't it?
Absolutely. And also with us, Craig Lawton, who is a politician and advisor for the Welsh Conservatives, now working at Grasshopper Communications. Hello, Craig.
Hi, Ollie. How's it going?
Yeah, all good. Thank you. You've got this to look forward to if you're going to Conservative conference. So I look forward to hearing your voice next week, Craig. Right, coming up on the podcast today, what the Labour Party conference in Liverpool told us about relations between Westminster and Wales, how a by-election in Caerphilly this month might play out and what it can tell us about the road to May, and why the Senedd might not be able to keep running. And along the way, we do have a WhatsApp number. It's great for sending your comments and questions as you're listening to the podcast, and then we'll read them out in the next episode. We'll also use it when you come and join us for our live recordings in the future. Look forward to that. The number 0333 404 6507, and just start your message with the word Senedd. Or you can email us with your questions and comments as well. The email address is hello@senedsources.com. So let's kick off. As I say, I'm feeling a little bit under the weather because it was Labour Party conference in Liverpool this week, and there was quite a lot to take away from it in terms of what Keir Starmer had to say about the Senedd elections coming up in May, but also what the First Minister, Eluned Morgan, had to say about her relationship with Number 10. So first of all, Joe, as someone who has been there, done it, advised a Welsh First Minister, gone to conference, I imagine, multiple times. What did you make of it looking at Labour conference?
Well, there was a lot at stake, wasn't there? We went into the conference with big questions over Keir Starmer's leadership, Eluned Morgan knowing that she needs more from the UK government ahead of next May. So there were quite a few tick boxes that needed to be addressed. Just starting off with the speeches, I thought there was a remarkable difference in tone, in energy, in punchiness from the main speeches, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves in particular. In terms of Keir's speech, I think it was a bit too long, if I'm honest. There were some nice parts to it, particularly where he picked out people who were activists in their community and thanked them and showed that there is another way of rejuvenating and going back to the kind of community that reform keeps harking on about. And, you know, he's right that there's been a massive shift in the structure of our politics with the absence of the Tories, and I'll be interested in Craig's view on this in a moment, but, you know, they hardly got a mention. And in politics, you need an enemy, don't you? You need someone to focus your firepower on. He firmly did that with reform. Some would say, you know, he should have done it sooner. But I was very conscious that he was fighting for his life. He needed to see off the Andy Burnham threat. He needed to rally his own MPs, let alone the activists out in the country who are just feeling a bit dejected at the moment. And particularly here in Wales, there was a lot of talk about the next election. We've got an election here next May. It's really kind of crucial for us. So I think that the way he framed it, the battle ahead, light on policy. I thought that this sort of HE apprenticeship announcement, which was quite interesting, was kind of thrown away a bit. But a solid 7 out of 10, I think. And it will have given some heart to the people who go out door knocking day in, day out. And boy, did they badly need that.
Yeah, totally. And Craig, that is an interesting point that Joe raises there in terms of a lot of Westminster watchers came off the back of sort of Keir Starmer's speech and thought, you know, well, this is basically an election campaign speech. And, you know, he's only just won an election. You know, this isn't a speech that you would expect from the sitting Prime Minister with a few years ahead of him in Number 10. But the reality is the actual, you know, crunch point potentially for Keir Starmer's future and for Labour's future will come in May here in Wales.
Yeah, it's interesting you say, obviously, it was Labour conference. It felt a bit like we had another reform conference, potentially. The amount of coverage and mentions that reform were getting. I've never seen a conference where Joe has talked about speaking about the opposition. The opposition was spoken about so much. And a lot of the conversations I'm having, and I'm sure Joe's in a similar situation with politicians from all sides, reform is one of the first words that comes up. And it seems that it was the same in this conference as well. I'm not surprised there wasn't a huge amount of policy, in fairness, because, we're less than 2 years after a general election. The policies should have been set out. They should be being delivered as we speak. This should be an opportunity for the Prime Minister and the party in government to set out what they've achieved and set a tone, as we say. I think it's interesting that they are really giving some real focus to the Senedd elections and setting a tone for that. It's very different to what we've seen from UK government in the past. And it's a positive, I would say, because it means that actually the government realises that there is something happening in Wales, which hasn't always been the case. Let's be realistic.
No, you're absolutely right on that. And I thought it was interesting that there was a lot of show of kind of Eluned and Keir Starmer together, the hugs, she made it very clear at Welsh Night that she's given him a list. Didn't elaborate much on what's on that list, but we know, that she is absolutely firm in that she needs to see extra investment in Wales ahead of next May. Contrast that with Rachel Reeves's speech saying that she couldn't rule out tax rises in the budget. And, we're only 6-7 weeks away from that, aren't we? That is going to be crucial. And I suppose I came away from the conference speeches thinking, actually, he's fine for now. He's bought some time, but the budget is going to be crucial in how people in Wales feel going into the last 4 or 5 months of the election campaign here. But I think the realisation that Keir Starmer's future hangs on what happens in Wales in particular, but Scotland too, in May, has concentrated minds a bit. And good. Glad to see it.
What do we make of, though, Eluned Morgan and Joe Stevens constantly talking about how they do get on, they're working together? For me, the more they say how they do get on and how they are a great team, the more it's just speaking to the fact that everybody feels like there is a division there.
How cynical you are, Craig.
Well, when you're in opposition, you sit through everything and you go, where are the chinks in the armour?
Yeah.
Where are the questions we need to ask?
do you know what? I think every relationship between a First Minister and a Welsh Secretary has had its moments. Actually, maybe not with Paul Murphy, who I genuinely struggle to think of an issue when he was Welsh Secretary. But, they've got to please their own side to some extent. There was an issue recently, wasn't there, about Eluned saying Joe Stevens had put words into her mouth. They both know there's a lot at stake for both of them next May. I think relationships are generally pretty good. I think they're both straight-talking women, which is good. They can just be very direct with each other. I don't think they're the kind to take offence. And Eluned had some nice lines, didn't she, in her speech? The sort of, reform wanting to flog off or frack off everything that moves. She knows too just how much the immigration debate, and we'll come on to Caerphilly in a moment, but just how much that immigration debate is affecting things here in Wales. And so that's a pretty crucial aspect of future delivery from UK government for her too.
I thought it was interesting, though, because she essentially stuck the knife into Plaid Cymru as well. She spoke about reform and she spoke about Plaid and essentially said, voting for either of them is going to have huge negative impacts from their perspective. And I thought it was interesting because from an election perspective, with a by-election in the future, you need to say this. But realistically, are those words going to come back to bite the Labour Party, not necessarily Eluned Morgan, in 7 or 8 months when we don't know what discussions might be happening post-Senedd election?
Yeah, the language used was harsher than I expected, and it featured in FMQs in the Senedd this week, didn't it, with Rhynat Iorwerth saying that it was not language that he would have expected. But it's a difficult one because Keir Starmer was firmly framing the fight in English terms in his speech. It's a choice between Labour and Reform. We know that they're hemorrhaging support in England massively to reform, but here in Wales, we're also fighting Plaid. They're neck and neck in the polls. And so she had to have something to differentiate. Did I like the language used? Not so much. It reminded me of back in 2007 when we had coalition negotiations and we had them going on between Labour and Plaid, and there was a Rainbow Coalition negotiations going on at the same time. And Ollie Morgan who was then First Minister, made a comment at the time, it was a choice between the inedible and the unpalatable. That went down. I mean, that was less fierce language. It went down really badly. Plaid, I remember at the time, their negotiating team were really, really unhappy. So language does matter when so much is at stake later on. And I think a lot of politicians think in the short term. Actually, longer term planning and thinking is really important, because it's not only the election next May. There's a budget coming up, which we'll talk about in more detail in a little bit. But you've got to be thinking about the budget. You've got to be thinking about the outcome of next May, what might be needed in terms of ensuring that there's a progressive government in place. So, yeah, food to think on, I think.
When I worked at the Senedd, when I worked for a Welsh Conservative MS in opposition, we would have a long list that we would add to regularly of comments that had been made in the media, or even sort of side throwaway comments that had been made on stages at conferences that aren't always reported on. We would keep a little bank of those, and then we'd see where we could weave those into questions. And I think far too often questions are asked of First Ministers, and they're all very aggressive. But actually, we used to like to throw in one of your ministers said 6 months ago X. How do you feel about that now? And it's just sit back and watch. So that was always sort of something that we would like to do.
Yeah, we might see in May sort of shades of was it Cameron and Clegg in The Garden of Number 10 just after buddying up, where David Cameron was asked, you called that man a joke, and he had to put his hands up and say yes, it's terrible.
Oh, listen, we've got to be grown-ups. Politics is a game, and there'll be a lot of things said between now and next May that can be thrown back. It's part of the game.
So I think the other part that sort of shone for me out of Labour conference was, the tension running up to the election, the importance for Eluned Morgan to put on the map, both reform as an opposition and Plaid Cymru. And she probably went harder on the Plaid bit because Keir Starmer hadn't been saying that bit, because from a sort of national perspective across the UK, that's not really something that's necessarily going to be on Keir Starmer's radar as the lines to take, the things to spin out every day. But there's also a tension a little bit between still Westminster Labour and Labour in the Senedd. Eluned Morgan gave an interview to the I newspaper during conference, basically saying, well, look, Keir Starmer didn't ask for my help in the general election. I'm not necessarily going to ask for his help in the Senedd elections and a by-election in Caerphilly, and just took a little bit of a dig. And there was also quite a lot in the room chat about the tension in terms of UK policy, what was worked on a UK level, in terms of renewables, in terms of the stuff that, for example, Ed Miliband is putting out, and the reality on the ground in Wales, where a lot of people are saying, well, hang on, this is perfectly fine for the long term. Okay, renewables might be the jobs of the future, but what are the jobs of tomorrow? What am I supposed to do to bridge that gap? And that answer's not really there, which shows, I think, Craig, as someone who has been in that opposition role, has been trying to sort of work out the tension points to sort of play at. There really still is, between UK policy and the reality on the ground in Wales, quite a lot of tension between the two Labour parties.
Yeah, and I think in any other time we would see all the opposition parties going in on that, but actually they're not particularly. They're all just talking about reform. It's a really bizarre thing. I think if you look at the record of proceedings for the Senedd, Reform are getting so many mentions and they haven't got a single, they do, Reform do have a member there now, but they have one. They have no other real representation, and yet they are mentioned probably more than most of the parties. It's quite interesting. But yeah, I think, that uncertainty around what's actually going to be delivered, as an example, around renewables is a really interesting one, because we've been hearing for a long time from Welsh Government the talk about the need to achieve net zero, decarbonise our economy. And we've seen a bit of a shift recently. It has moved from decarbonisation to jobs and to energy security and to cost of living. So I think they do realise that there has been a shift here and they're trying to realign that. But I wonder if it's too late.
I think also, was it yesterday that our bills went up again? I think there's a real realization, and this came up more in conference than perhaps I was expecting about, cost of living, how tough people are finding it. I wish they would stop using this kind of phrase, growth. We need to see growth, particularly Rachel Reeves. I think it needs to be broken down into nuts and bolts. It's jobs, it's money in people's pockets, it's people feeling that they have more resources to do the things that they want to do for their families. And so, this sort of long-term aims are all very well, but I think it's the practicalities of today and tomorrow in terms of jobs in particular. And Ollie, it was interesting, the point you made about Eluned's interview and, Keir not asking her to be part of the election campaign. She's done lots of interviews in Wales over the weekend, here too, and consistently that question came up of how much Keir Starmer would play a part in the election next May, how much he'll play a part in the Caerphilly by-election, will he be pitching up? And both of them looked terribly uncomfortable. That kind of assessment of whether he's, a help or a hindrance clearly hasn't been made yet. My betting is that he won't pitch up to Caerphilly, that, he's not enough of an asset at the moment to risk it. Plus, if he comes and the polls are borne out in terms of results, does he really want to have been pictured on the doorsteps there?
I was going to say, there's two ways of looking at this. There's one which is, we don't want Keir Starmer to turn up because it's only going to go the wrong way. The other one is Labour have potentially accepted that this by-election has been lost and they don't want to tar him with that. And I wonder, as you said, is there a discussion as to which it is, or is it just actually, we won't go there? But I guess you've talked about electoral asset. Genuinely, who is the electoral asset for Labour and Welsh Labour at present? Is it Eluned Morgan? She's been doing a lot to try and put herself, as you've said, in a different position. We've seen her, since she became First Minister, actually, she's really tried to do things differently, be very outgoing, engaging, and that works with some people, but it doesn't work with a lot of other people still. So who is the vote winner for Labour at present?
Yeah, and it's interesting. In the past, it's always been the First Minister who's been front and centre of Assembly, now Senedd election campaigns. There's been lots of talk about the Keir Starmer lacking personality. People don't know him. Eluned's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, really, with the dancing at conference. She does a lot of going around Wales, a lot of videos, and she clearly thinks that is helping her. But I think that it's difficult when the polls are the way they are to gee yourself up. And I think part of the importance of conference for me was just stopping Labour activists, as it were, writing themselves off. We've still got to fight. And the one thing that Labour has always been good at in Wales is just getting up, picking themselves up, bashing those doors. So it's got to be, regardless of what happens in Caerphilly, we have to think there's still a fight worth fighting for next May.
And I would say on Eluned, it's really interesting because I remember taking doctors to go and meet with her when she was the health minister, and she would be really personable. She knew her stuff. She was really engaging. And you might just say, oh, it's all an act. But at the end of meetings, people came away from it thinking like they actually got to know her and that she cared and she listened. She would follow. Not all politicians do this. She'd follow up the meeting and she'd say, it was great to have met with you. I'd like to follow up on that. Could we meet in the future? Not all ministers do that,
no,
even if they want to.
And she's famous for sort of, just meeting people randomly, having a good chat, being interested, and actually giving them her sort of personal email or whatever.
I'm glad you said that. So
I want to, I want to follow up on this. I think that it's a great trait to have. How much time she actually has in between running the country to do that is another matter. But she is very personable.
Yeah, I at the end of a meeting once, she said to a doctor, can I have your mobile number? And I thought, oh my goodness, where's this going? And then they said to her, can I have yours? And I was like, there's nothing I'm just going to stand back and let this happen. There's nothing I can do here.
And did she?
They swapped numbers. I don't know whatever came of it. Yeah.
She is very much one of those politicians who I think sort of authentically says what what she thinks, or at least says as she sees it, which I have to say at Labour conference, the one point on that, which I would just bring up, which is on renewables, which might be a point that maybe she shouldn't have said it as she saw it, where the couple of Labour MPs told me that privately she's said that, renewable jobs are basically too expensive and we don't want any of those, thank you, before the next election. So quietening down on those might be to come. In terms of electoral assets, I did find it also interesting at Welsh Night how many members of the cabinet were there. I mean, it was just full. I mean, Wes Streeting was there, Richard Hermer, the Attorney General, was there, Ed Miliband spoke, which, drew the ire of a few people. But, he spoke. There was a real presence in that room, the likes of you don't always get.
I would say, though,
Night.
that Lord Hermer is from Cardiff, if I'm correct. Is he not, Joe?
I think so. I wouldn't bet my house on it, but I think so.
I'm pretty certain he is. And I've always found with party conferences that the nation events actually draw a lot of people to them, because always surprised how many people have a link to, in this case, Wales, and want to come and find out what's going on and show support. So I'm always really surprised. And it's the same at Conservative conferences as well. You get Michael Fabricant, obviously is a bit Welsh, used to always pop in. I'm really surprised. So yeah, it's amazed how many people have a link to Wales when there is a drinks reception anyway, let's put it that way.
Well, also, I think it's about showing support. As we said earlier, I think that the message of just how much Welsh Labour needs support, needs some goodies from UK Labour, the Labour government, and I think that message is sunk in. So I think it was about solidarity as well as a warm glass of wine.
Lots more to come. We are going to be talking about how all of that energy at a Labour conference in Liverpool might be put towards the by-election looming in Caerphilly very soon. And remember to subscribe on your podcast app, or you can watch us on YouTube. Just search for Senedd Sources, where we upload full episodes for you to enjoy. And WhatsApp us as you're listening, of course, with questions or comments, ideally using a voice note so we can play it out on next week's episode. That's 0333 404 6507, and start your message with the word Senedd. We will be right back. Let's move then to that sort of really urgent electoral test, an election in Caerphilly, a by-election after the sad passing of Hebyn David. And well, I mean, it is remarkable. A lot of people say in Labour, Joe, that on the doorstep it's quite tricky for them and they're not having a wonderful time. It must also be said that apparently there are no women in Caerphilly because the whole slate of candidates are just blokes. So in the run-up to that, we are a few weeks away. Joe, is there anything that Welsh Labour can do to sort of stop what voters already have in their heads, I suppose?
It's really tough, and interestingly, not just from people from Labour who are knocking on doors, but I'm also hearing it from Plaid Cymru too, is that, immigration is still coming up on the door, 70% of the time. And it's really interesting because the journalist Will Hayward, who has the Will Hayward newsletter that comes out twice a week, did some digging into the number of people living in each local authority area who were born outside the UK. Caerphilly actually has the lowest number in the whole of Wales. It's 2.9%. And yet that message doesn't seem to be getting through. It is very much focused on not just my local area, but what's happening in the country at large. The reform leaflets are just absolutely incessantly focusing on that issue. Interestingly, the candidate there, one of the many men standing there, as you say, Ollie, but the reform candidate is facing some tricky questions at the moment because he used to work for Nathan Gill, who people will probably remember pleaded guilty last week to accepting Russian money when he was an MP for raising statements. Quite how much he knew about that, given activists from other parties something to grab hold on, if you like. And whereas we're used to seeing reform pylons on social media for other parties, the Nation of Sanctuary, etc., he's getting a bit of that himself at the moment. Quite whether that's going to resonate with voters, I'm not convinced. But I think that we can't give up, basically. It's going to be really, really tough. But I think the interesting thing about it for me, as an aside, is it will give us some indication indication of whether the polling is on track. Because, we've spoken before about not being quite sure how much those reform voters or people who say they intend to vote reform will actually turn out. So I think there will be a lot of strategizing after this result in terms of how people go forward to next May.
Talking about the immigration point, though, I think what's interesting is you were talking earlier, Ollie, about Rachel Reeves talking about growth, and I'd actually compare it to that. So there may be economic growth happening, but people aren't feeling it, especially here, and they're not perceiving it as impacting on them. And actually, that's even worse because they feel it's good somewhere else and it's not working for them. He looked at those figures. I think it was 2-something% of people in Caerphilly are born outside of the UK. But it's perception. And this is not a criticism of Will, but I would say I'd be really interested to then see him take a look at unemployment figures for the constituency, potentially numbers of people in receipt of families in receipt of free school meals, families in receipts of benefits. I think that would be really interesting, and it would give us an indication as to what do they actually feel, what are they perceiving. Immigration may not impact on Caerphilly, but people obviously aren't happy with how things are, and they're perceiving the immigration point as being something that is impacting on that.
Yeah, it's back to the pennies in their pocket, isn't it? Yeah. It's whether they feel that they're getting a fair enough crack of the whip in terms of jobs and opportunities, and patently people don't feel that.
And they're so close to Cardiff. This is the thing. There are other MSs that talk about this quite regularly as well. You have constituencies so very, very close to Cardiff, within commuting distance, but they feel no benefit from what they see as the bustling metropolis of Wales, the capital of Wales, where all that growth, the shiny buildings are being built. The other side of the M4, and they don't feel it, but they're seeing it happening somewhere else. That's the problem.
Just taking one statistic necessarily, tells you the whole picture, because it's as if, like you say, Caerphilly is quite close to Cardiff. It's as if people don't move from that constituency. You don't see the wider picture. And similarly, it's quite difficult to, particularly in a by-election, get away from the fact that in a lot of people's heads, they are purely casting a judgment on the political landscape as they see it more widely, not necessarily on what might change between now and, in 8 months' time at the Senedd itself. So that is interesting. Well, you mentioned, Joe, about turnout and actually about how we're unsure whether the polling is going to be reflective of, because it's very easy to answer a poll. It takes a lot more to get people actually out to vote on the day. And it is the real unknown, I think, particularly in Wales, where a few weeks ago at a Reform conference, I was staggered by how they'd managed to bring together a sort of coalition of people who I don't think had ever really voted properly before. They might have come out for Brexit or once or twice here or there. But, these were people who, watch Anthony Deck's Saturday Night Takeaway on an evening, go to the pub once a week, but really just don't engage in politics and might have, say, once in their life. Whereas the data that people are working with will be how people have voted before. So going out on the doorstep, you get a list and you say, okay, well, we know this person's a Labour voter. We know this person's a Plaid voter. So I suppose there's a glimmer of particular hope for Plaid Cymru that at least they know that their voters are more likely to turn out in a by-election or in something like this than Reform, which is going to be a big unknown.
That's absolutely right. Plaid voters will turn out. Now, I think one of the interesting things is that in the past, Labour's success was down to having really good voter data and really good activists, really good foot soldiers to get out there, which, as I say, they need a bit of oomph, which Keir's speech will have done to some extent to keep doing that doggedly in Caerphilly, despite what the polls say. But I think in terms of Plaid, Welsh Labour was also good in the past at capturing the sort of soft nationalists, the people who were proudly Welsh, don't particularly sort of feel like independence is a road they want to go down, but we were really good at sort of targeting that. The problem for Labour is that with a Labour government in the Senedd and at Westminster, the reasons, economically that we've just been discussing, they are shifting to Plaid Cymru, and they will turn out and vote. So that's what I mean. With Plaid and Reform neck and neck in the polls, I'm going to be really interested to see whether those people who like to go to the pub once a week, don't generally engage with politics, whether on the news or sort of like locally, actually come out. Now, they did for the Brexit vote. Might assume they will come out, will be energised enough, and particularly if it's just to give a bloody nose to the ruling party. But we'll see. We don't know.
Yeah, it could go one of two ways, couldn't it? Because I was having this conversation with someone actually last night after the Public Affairs Cymru annual dinner, and the example they gave to me was shy Tories. So actually, people who are conservative-minded often don't take part in opinion polls, don't give you their opinion. And actually, we've seen opinion polls before which have underestimated the Conservative vote. That's not going to happen this time. That's not what I'm leading to.
Glad you said that.
But I wonder whether there is an element of that with some Reform voters, potentially. Actually, it could go either way. It could be, as you said, Joe, rightly, their foundation and their base is very weak. They're people that have come to support Reform very recently. If it's raining, the football's on, will they decide to go and vote? But equally, is it being underestimated? We saw the Brexit vote underestimated during the referendum. I know that opinion polls now have been changed and formulas have been amended to account for that, but they can only ever account for what has happened in the past. And may we see opinion polls and formulas change again based on this outcome? It's on such a knife edge. We just don't know at this stage.
Yeah.
But I think it could go either way. There is a genuine argument that the Reform vote could be slightly underestimated.
I think you're right. And for the first time in the last couple of weeks, I've started to think that the Reform vote might be underbaked. And also just what that means in terms of next May. Is there a possibility that we would get Reform having enough to govern in Cardiff Bay with or without the Tories supporting them? So, yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating to see the outcome.
I was having a conversation with a journalist recently, and they said they did an interview with Nigel Farage, and he said they said off camera, they can definitely win a majority. And the journalist was like, no, you can't. And he was like, no, we've done the maths, we can. And I would say, there is definitely a bravado and messaging there, but if there's one party that does things differently and gets really down to the data and does things in a way that others don't when it comes to online presence and targeting, it's fair to say it is what is now Reform.
Yeah, and there's a momentum. Whether that momentum will see them through to next May, a lot can happen. But I think there's certainly momentum at the moment going into the Caerphilly by-election.
I have mulled over whether actually the best thing for Welsh Labour could be a Reform victory in this by-election, because I wonder whether what it will say to potential Labour voters and former Labour voters is, this is what you actually get if you flirt with voting for Reform. The example I've given in the past is, I remember campaigning in Gower in 2015, and the Conservatives won by 27 votes to win that seat for the first time ever. Labour didn't even think they were going to lose it. And actually, it was the best thing that could have happened for them, because it made the party, but it also made supporters in the constituency realise you cannot mess about. If you don't turn out and vote, or if you think you're going to send a message, this is the outcome you get. I'll be honest, I think we're too far down the road for that now, but it's something I have mulled over.
I think it's a really difficult one, and I'm saying that it might be easier for Labour. The huge problem with that is just what will change in Wales during that term. We wouldn't have stable government for very long. I firmly believe they
I'm
would
talking just the
fracture.
Caerphilly by-election, not the Senedd election
Okay.
next year. I wonder whether it
And
would
to
kick them
regroup,
into
yes. Sorry, I
changing
thought you were
themselves for
talking
next year.
about next May, and I'm just kind of thinking the havoc that could be wreaked, and the people who would suffer potentially as a result. But yes, I don't think anyone in Welsh Labour is pretending that we're going to win Caerphilly. I think we still need to battle for share of vote, etc. But you're right. I think that there will be, experience gained from having those two members of the Senedd going forward, if that's how it pans out, and it will give Labour heart and something to mull over and some ammunition, frankly.
It also puts on the table the possibility of a leadership race between the two Welsh Reform members of the Senedd, which could be quite interesting, which actually could be quite advantageous for other parties. If you say, well, look, here's one person who used to advise Nathan Gill, who last week admitted to taking money from the Russians, and the other person used to be a Conservative. So if you go that way, you're just getting the Tories in a different clothing anyway. So it opens up that prospect of something a bit more interesting happening, particularly in the reform landscape in Wales. Well, one consequence of that Caerphilly by-election is whether the Senedd can actually fund itself. Just explain to us a little bit about what's going on here, Jeff.
So in terms of getting the next Welsh Government budget through, you need 31 of the 60 people to vote for it. Labour had 30 members until the very sad and too early death of Heaven David. Last year they did a deal with Jane Dodds, the sole Lib Dem, to get their budget through. That won't be enough this time should Reform win the Caerphilly by-election. And of course, Eluned Morgan has already said that, there's a lot at stake. She's used this as a line to help Labour in Caerphilly. And so we had this extraordinary intervention yesterday, really, by the presiding officer who was giving evidence to a Senedd committee, saying that actually at the point where we're going to be expanding the Senedd, an extra 36 members and taking the number from 60 to 96 MSs going forward, that all might be at stake, and that, if the budget doesn't get through, it might mean that even the MSs themselves don't get paid. I'm not sure there's going to be a huge amount of public sympathy on that bit, frankly. But I do think it's interesting in that she chose to say that. She didn't have to. And it's just interesting to me because a few months ago, and actually this probably was before Heaven's death, Plaid Cymru were absolute that they weren't going to be supporting the budget this year. They were saying privately that, the budget before an election, of course not. Why would we? Sort of, we're in campaigning mode and, they could challenge a lot of the decisions made in the budget. I'm sensing a slight change in mind at the moment. And this goes back to the point I made earlier about short-term and longer-term thinking. I think partly because of Heaven's death, but also because minds are now turning to what might happen next May. What are the ramifications of what the polls are telling us? Might Plaid need those Labour votes in order to get a Plaid FM elected, etc.? It's all kind of whirring around, and I'm just hearing that they might be minded to think again on withholding support.
Yeah, but here's an idea. Plaid Cymru are waiting to enter government as the biggest party for the first time in their history. What could be better than them saying to their members and current Labour voters, this is what we would do with a budget. This is what we want. This is what you'll get if you vote for us next year. And if Labour don't allow us to have it and get their budget through, it's their fault. What could be better for them than setting out exactly what they would do next year and putting the pressure on Labour to accept it? It will wreak havoc with Reform and only allow people who are supporting them to continue to support them. But actually, it may just continue to see further Labour support move across to Plaid Cymru.
Well, it's funny because Uncle Mark, as we fondly call the finance minister here, Mark Drakeford, has already said that it's kind of just a flat budget, really, isn't it? That he's leaving a bit of a war chest, such as it is, it's not huge, for the next incoming government to. So, I think he's done everything he can to show that he's playing fair. But it's a risk, isn't it? And I just think that Ellen Jones, part of Plaid Cymru, making this intervention is quite significant.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think we've heard similar from Eluned Morgan a few weeks ago, where she said, if you don't vote Labour in the Caerphilly by-election, we won't get our budget through. We could see more austerity. We could see tax rises. And it felt like they criticised the Conservatives before. It felt like they were replicating them with Project Fear. I didn't see how the Llawedd put it. I wonder if did she speak very much factually, and it has been harnessed by the media, or do you feel there was an undertone to it, Joe? I haven't seen it. I've only seen it reported.
I think, well, I have too. To be fair, I didn't have a time to look back and watch over it. But I think that line about not being able to pay salaries could have been framed differently, couldn't it? About concerns about the expansion, which she went into. The fact that she said it would be almost impossible to keep the Senedd running. You know, this wasn't mild concerns.
I would say, though, that there's a good proportion of the population that will hear that, and what they'll hear is, if I vote for reform, our money won't get given to politicians and the place might get closed down. And some people would like that.
Regardless of what happens in the Caerphilly by-election, because we kind of can all make a pretty good guess at the outcome of it, I think minds will be concentrated towards next May and the importance of getting a budget through.
Are we going to take a guess on what's going to happen in Caerphilly?
No.
We could and review it every week.
Let's wait until after the Caerphilly by-election results and maybe do it for next May.
Let's do one right now, which is, will the Tories win it? Craig?
I mean, that's the easiest one. No.
Okay, well, look, if you are listening and you are the proud owner of the world's smallest violin, then perhaps it's time to get it out for the pay packets of members of the Senedd over the next few weeks. But plenty can change and to look forward to in the next few weeks in Welsh politics. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Craig. Now, don't forget, press subscribe on your podcast app, and you can find us to watch on YouTube as well, and we'll drop into your feeds every week with the latest on Welsh politics and policymaking. You will not miss a thing. Thanks so much for listening. This has been Senedd Sources, and we'll talk to you again next week.